Morning. Great to see all of you. I'm going to have my lovely assistant here move the podium. I'm usually doing that for him at all of his things, but we are so grateful to be here with you today. I do have to have just a proud mom moment that this crew up here is my family. A long time ago. So my husband's a pastor, and I'll get to that in just a minute. But as soon as we started seeing that our kids were musical, we were kind of, and I don't know, just dreaming one day, and my husband and I were like, wouldn't that be cool if like Dad spoke or I spoke, and then our kids led worship somewhere? And 3 days before I got the call from Diane, my husband and I and our oldest Max were chatting, and Max is like, Mom, that's still the dream. And I'm like, I know, Max, I know. And 3 days later, Diane called and she's like, is there a way your family would lead worship all day? So, lots of tears that day. So God is good. God is good. Oh, Mama. And I just have to say, the girl on the drums, the first song, that was the first time she's ever played in front of a crowd. So I'm very proud of her. So now she's coming back, Jakely. You got this. All right, so I'm going to share a little bit of my heart and my heart with you guys today, and that video is going to hit, it did hit a little close to home for me, and you'll see in a minute. So this is my heart, and I would love to just introduce my family to you a little bit. So my husband, Chris, he is a youth pastor at Becker Evangelical Free Church in Becker, Minnesota, where we've been for 21 years. We love the Becker community. Prior to that, we actually got to serve here. This is my hometown. And he was the youth pastor at, well, now it's Aldersgate, but it used to be First United Methodist back when we were here. So that was just wonderful to be here, but he's like, what, going to be 54 tomorrow, and he's still a youth pastor. So, crazy. Keeps us young, right? The rest of this gorgeous bunch are our children. So Max was the leader here. He is 27. He's married to his wife, Sydney, who is singing over here. And they have 4 of my grandkids. Crosby is 5, Sadie is 4, Haven is 2, and Roman just turned 1. And then Macy, she was on the keyboard. She is married to her southern sweetheart, Chase. And they have another of my grandchildren, Judah. And then she's got a little girl coming the end of May. So, love being a grandma. Then I have 2 boys. Tigan was back here on the bass. Tate was on the piano and then the drums. And Tigan is 19, Tigan is 21 and Tate is 19. And the rest of our children are girls. They were all singing over here. Brinkley is 17, Britlin is 15, and Jakely is 13. And the next slide shows you our sweet Jensen, and she's forever 6 and a half. So these photos encapsulate both my heart and my heart. My family has always been the biggest part of my heart, and this photo of our daughter and their sister represents the intense heart that our family has gone through the past few years. Let me tell you a little bit about me first. As a young girl, I was a dreamer, but I had very specific dreams. I knew I wanted to be a mom, and after receiving Christ at a very young age, I remember telling my mom that I was going to marry a pastor someday. I've always wanted to be a game show host. And I've always wanted to write a book. Well, I did marry a pastor. I have 8 children, and I have finally realized my dream of writing a book. Not sure about the game show host thing. I've been trying really hard to get on a show. Every time there's something, my kids are like, Mom, you gotta try to get on that, but nobody wants to pick someone from Minnesota, I guess. Well, much has happened in my life since those early days of dreaming about my future. It was about a year ago, my daughter Brinkley and I were in the car coming back from an appointment or something, and out of the blue she asked, Mom, has your life turned out the way you thought it would? And I thought that was a very insightful question, and I didn't answer her right away. I just needed a little bit of time to process that. All but one of my dreams have been realized, the dreams that carry the most meaning for me, but they haven't exactly played out the way I would have envisioned them to. I've learned that being married to a pastor is as much a calling for me as it is for him. For us to navigate life with a pastor, we have had to make sacrifices for him to be with the church families over the years. And marriage and parenting in the fishbowl of a pastor's life has not always been easy. I learned that even though I've wanted to be a mom more than anything, I never thought I would have 8 children. That story actually happens that we miscarried our first baby, and I was at a women's conference, much like this, in Aberdeen. It's a little bit smaller than this, way back. But at the end, they had called us up if we wanted prayer. And I wanted a baby so badly that I decided that I would go forward and get prayer. And after that time of prayer, there was a woman there that I didn't know personally, but I knew of her great faith. And she walked up to me and asked me, "Have you ever considered letting God decide the size of your family?" And then she suggested I read a book called A Full Quiver. Well, books are my love language, so I devoured the book. I shared it with my husband, and we were convinced that this was God's plan for us. But parenting all of these personalities, 2 of them with special needs, has been really crazy hard at times. And I have learned that even though I was given the extreme honor of writing a book, the content of that book has been anything but easy. I mentioned that our youngest daughter, Jensen, is forever 6.5. I say that because that's the age she was when she passed away in March of 2023. She battled a rare medical condition called trisomy 5P. Figuring out how to do life without her has been pretty difficult. And even though there are days that the grief is still heavy, we are slowly starting to move forward. But even learning how to mention her when I list my kids and their ages, that has been a little challenging, but I'm learning. Well, 3 days after Jensen's funeral, one of our former youth kids from our first youth group here in Aberdeen, actually, he's in Minnesota now, but he reached out to me with the name of a publisher friend of his. Early on in Jensen's life, I knew that this was finally the story that God had given me to write, but never did I think I would do it so soon after her death. After all we had gone through, I was tired, I was numb. I just didn't think I would be able to do it at that point. But I had a very wise uncle who said, the farther you get away from her passing, the less real and raw it might be. And your perspective might change a little bit. So I called the publisher. She told me I had 6 months to write the book, and it was the most excruciating, exhilarating thing I've ever done. When I first met with my publisher, she asked me what I wanted the theme of my book to be. I had no idea, and I'm an English teacher, so I know that you have to know that if you're going to write something. But it didn't take me long to figure it out. Through Jensen's life, God has taught our family many, many things, but 3 things stand out the most. So this is what I told her. All life is valuable, God can be trusted, and there is hope in the hard. So let's take a look at these 3 themes from our journey with our daughter. All life is valuable. Let me share Jensen's life first. Psalm 139, 13 through 14 says, "I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful. I know this full well." This might seem obvious to you, a no-brainer. I always believed in the value of life. Even when Kristin and I decided to let God decide how many kids we would have, I thought that proved how much I valued life. But then baby number 6 and baby number 8 were born with genetic disorders. Unintentionally, I think I believed that God would give us normal, healthy babies. How often, as a pregnant mama, had I answered the question of, do you want a boy or a girl with, either is fine as long as it's healthy. As long as it's healthy. But what happens when it isn't? Then what do we do? And what does as long as it's healthy even mean? When our Britlin was born, she was small, she didn't nurse well, but she was otherwise super content. She was our easiest baby. Yet after having 5 other children without any concerns, it soon became evident that she was not developing and progressing as her older siblings had. We later discovered that she was born with a genetic disorder. Hers is a deletion in her 10th chromosome. So we sought specialists, and we did whatever we needed to do to get her the therapies she needed to catch up and flourish. For the most part, her special circumstances were well received, and there's a wonderful community of people who have loved her and helped her to become the awesome young woman she is today. When Britlin was 5, her sister Jensen was born. Now, I was getting up there in age. I was 43 when I was pregnant with Jensen, and I had so I had my first two babies here in Aberdeen. Shout out to Dr. Walks. Just a bit ago, I don't know if he's even still, yeah. And then my other children were born nearby where we lived in Becker. When we moved to Becker, I was 8 months pregnant with my third child. So I called my college roommate who was instrumental in getting us there, and I was like, yeah, I need a doctor right away. So she told me about her family doctor, and I went to him, and I've stayed with him, the rest of the time. And he had delivered the other kids, but with this one, he was kind of like, I don't know, you should probably go to an OB, you're getting kind of up there, and you're going to have to farm you out for ultrasounds and stuff. Well, I didn't know what to do. So I called my other best friend, who has 13 children, and I was like, Becky, where should I go, right? So she's like, St. Cloud. So I had doctored in a smaller town. Now we're in St. Cloud. It's this big town. I didn't know any of the doctors at that hospital. I didn't know really my doctor except for the pregnancy. And I say all this because I remember specifically the day after Jensen's birth. Our entire family was in the room with us, and the rounding pediatrician came by to kind of check on her. And like I said, we didn't know anybody there. So he had a really gruff bedside manner, but maybe that's just who he was. So we were all sitting there, and he went in to examine her, and he started to share a list of things that were wrong with her. Her fingers were too long, her toes curled, her ears were crumpled, and her forehead was too large. To conclude his visit, he said, this little girl has a genetic disorder. And we were like, what? We've already been down that road. How does this happen to the same family twice? Well, after our world righted itself again, we embraced this new hurdle and began an even crazier journey. We knew God had prepared our family to endure this new life through Britlin's life. But we began to see that not everyone we encountered valued our youngest daughter. Jensen was later diagnosed with trisomy 5P. It's a super rare genetic disorder with only 50 known cases at the time of her birth. For the most part, the doctors and nurses we encountered in her life were super supportive and seemed to value life, but there were many instances when that was just not the case. The first time I saw the medical community focus more on death than life was when she was just a few months old. By 2 months of age, Jensen had a feeding tube. When she was not in the hospital, our weeks were full of appointments, but we had a rule that I would never go to an appointment by myself with her. So on this particular day, Brinkley came with me. We were meeting the GI doctor to discuss getting a more permanent feeding tube. As the nurse was checking us in, she asked me what was wrong with my daughter. I never minded answering that question. I was always willing to share Jensen's story and to enlighten anyone who asked. And on a side note, all moms love to talk about their kids, even if they have special needs. Not being asked was hard for me because people would just stare and not say anything. But I have learned that instead of saying what's wrong with your daughter or with your child, a better question is just to say, what's her story? Because we do really want to talk about our kids, no matter which one you ask about. Well, when the doctor came in, we chatted a little bit about where Jensen was at, and then he said, how long is Jensen supposed to live? I was shocked. Never had I anticipated such a question, and I am usually pretty chill. But we were talking about my daughter, so instead of answering his question the way he thought I probably would, I pointed at Brinkley and said, I don't know. How long is she supposed to live? It was the first time I had ever experienced someone in the medical community ask about death when I felt they should be more concerned with life. I'm not saying that was his intention at all, but I remember feeling so shocked. Over her 6.5 years of life, there were so many more instances when we were completely shocked by how many people felt it was more selfish to keep fighting for Jensen than to let her go. Jensen passed away in 2023, but we almost lost her in 2020 and again in 2022. Both times, doctors in palliative care had to talk with us about letting her go. Perhaps the worst example of an interaction with one of her doctors is when her pulmonologist responded to a request I had made. This was in 2020, so we wanted to keep her home as much as possible. And we had gotten really good at meeting on and anticipating her needs. Jensen was oxygen dependent at this point, and sometimes we needed a bit more oxygen than our concentrator could offer. So I messaged the pulmonologist in the portal to ask for a bigger machine. The doctor actually called me directly and asked me why I wanted it. After a little bit of small talk, she said, "How much longer are you going to do this, Kristin?" "How much longer am I going to do what?" I asked her. She replied, "How much longer are you going to suffer? How much longer is your family going to suffer? And Jensen, how much more can she take? How much longer are you going to keep this going?" I was beyond shocked. Of course, I began to cry, and through my sobs, I told her, "We are not suffering. Jensen is not suffering. Losing her would cause my family to suffer. She is the best thing that ever happened to us, and we will keep this going for as long as we need to." The value of life. Not everyone sees the value in every life, and I have come to believe that is because not everyone has an eternal perspective on life. When I think about all the times my pregnant self answered the question of boy or girl with either is fine as long as it's healthy, I have been so challenged by that. And maybe that is why God has allowed me to have 2 babies who have not seen life the same way as my other children have. This life is temporary, but eternal life is our goal. And that perspective changes everything. I will take whatever the Lord gives me, should have been my response, because every life is valuable. I also learned that God can be trusted. Delight yourself in the Lord, and He will give you the desires of your heart. Commit your way to the Lord, trust in Him, and He will do this. He will make your righteousness shine like the dawn. Psalm 37, 4-6. The second thing I learned by being Jensen's mom is that God can be trusted. Oh, how that sounds like a religious platitude. Just like all life being valuable, saying that God can be trusted comes across trite at best. As believers, we're supposed to say we trust in God, right? But do we? When I said I would let God decide the size of my family, did I trust Him to give me only what I could handle? I think I assumed He would do that. But did I truly trust Him? When we had our first daughter with special needs, we navigated that pretty well. So I would say that we trusted Him then. It wasn't that hard. Collectively, the family embraced her, and we did all we could to help her thrive. Therapy appointments, there were people in and out of our house throughout the week, doctor's appointments, eye surgeries. She didn't walk till she was 2.5, and she didn't talk until she was 4, and now she's singing on the stage, right? Life was not easy, but we trusted God, right? I definitely thought we did. Then when Jensen was born, after her battle with eating, getting her feeding tube, she started having seizures. We had trips to and from the hospital so many times that first year. And this all added to the chaos of our life. This was definitely a time when I had what Henry Blackaby calls a crisis of belief. A crisis of belief is a season of struggling and doubting God and His goodness in our life. This often happens because of a specific trigger, something unexpected or unthinkable, and it causes a person's faith to collapse. I've had many, but when Jensen was just a few months old, my crisis of belief was at an all-time high. I questioned everything about this new life I was living, the what-ifs and the whys, and it's not that I didn't think it shouldn't be my life, I just didn't know how to manage it. I'm a control freak at best, so it was difficult for me to wrap my mind around this life I had no chance of controlling. And often, when we're in a crisis of belief, we respond one of 2 ways, according to Blackaby. We either deny the bad, say everything's fine, or we turn our back on God and say He isn't real. But Pastor Craig Rochelle suggests there's a third response. In the middle of the pain, we can wrestle while we wait to embrace God's plan. In his book, Hope in the Dark, Rochelle talks about the Old Testament prophet Habakkuk and the meaning of his name. His name actually means to wrestle and to embrace. Habakkuk was a minor prophet who was unlike other prophets. Typically, the prophets would get a message from God for all the people. Well, Habakkuk got a message from the And the gist of his message was that he did not think that what God was doing seemed right or fair. This caused the people of that time to have a crisis of belief. During Jensen's first year of life, I was wrestling, and I had not yet embraced what was happening. Ladies, it is not helpful to give Christian platitudes to our sisters who are going through hard things. By all means, pray for them, and you can say that you are praying for them. But as a believer, in the midst of wrestling with one of the hardest times of my life, my spiritual life was at an all-time low. I couldn't pray. I wasn't in the Word. I was probably a little bit mad at God without even realizing it. And when I reached out to my friends in the church to let them know I was struggling, many of them asked, "How's your quiet time? What's your prayer life like? Are you in the Word?" Or they would say things like, "God won't give you more than you can handle." So many Christian platitudes that were not helpful at all. I just felt worse and worse about myself. One of the best pieces of advice I ever received was from my associate pastor's wife when I lived here in Aberdeen. I had just miscarried our first baby, and it was another time in my life when I was having a crisis of belief. Why did God take my baby after we've been trying for so long? Would I ever get to be a mom? When I told this pastor's wife that I was feeling so spiritually ambivalent that I couldn't even pray, she said this: "It's okay to let other people do your praying for you when you're going through a hard time." The freedom to take the pressure off myself was life-giving. And each time I have gone through something hard, I have remembered it. To this day, those words continue to give me comfort. There was no judgment there, just acceptance and encouragement to continue wrestling until I could eventually embrace God's goodness. I know my friends were coming from a good place, but it felt like judgment and criticism. And I have said the same thing to others going through hard times as well. We might mean well, but it is often not received well. How we respond to others when they are struggling says so much about God's work in our own lives. Unless our suffering draws us closer to God, it's hard to offer genuine compassion to others. Let's walk through the tough stuff alongside each other, allowing ourselves to live in our own realities, no matter what they look like, especially when we are having a crisis of belief. My reality with Jensen at the beginning was beyond difficult. My questions of God did not go away quickly, but because I had a foundation in what God had already done in my life during other times of crisis, I was eventually able to see things differently. So how can I believe that God can be trusted? I can believe because I remember. During the time of wrestling, if we can take our eyes off of ourselves for a minute and begin to remember all the times God has shown himself faithful in the past, we can begin to embrace what James chapter 1 verses 2 through 4 says. "Consider it pure joy when you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith develops perseverance. Let perseverance finish its work, so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything." When someone is in the middle of a crisis, that verse is hard to hear. But as we wrestle with what God is doing, we can anticipate the sweet embrace on the other side. So trust comes when we remember. Yes, I miscarried my first baby, but God blessed me with 8 more. My empathy for others who have gone through a miscarriage is huge because I know what they're feeling. Yes, I have a child with special needs, but God has allowed me more than a glimpse into what that life entails. And he's allowed my other children a compassion that most young people don't have a fraction of. Yes, I have buried a daughter. But what Jensen taught me in the 2,373 days she lived on this earth, and the way the loving has changed our lives, is an eternal blessing that is indescribable. It's priceless. So through all the countless small blessings, the faithful prayers, the generous provision, and the care I've watched my kids give each other, these are all reminders that prove he can be trusted. When we remember what God has done, this becomes so much more than a religious platitude. It becomes the reality that brings us out of our crisis of belief. But we have to be given the time and the space to wrestle within our reality so that God can rescue us from it. I love this quote from Pastor Rochelle. True intimacy with God is not to live on the mountaintop, but to know his faithfulness in the valley. We remember, so we know, God can be trusted. Finally, Jensen's life taught us this. There is hope in the hard. Just as I have wrestled with the belief that God can be trusted, I have also had a journey of embracing the true meaning of hard and how it relates to hope. Funny thing about hard, someone once said, if we were able to look around and see everybody else's hard, we would weirdly still choose our own. And I believe that's because we get really good at doing our hard. That was true for us. We didn't know any different. Our first year and a half with Jensen was very difficult for our family, and Christmas was upon us. I love Christmas, but what I love most at Christmas is getting mail. I love getting Christmas cards. My kids all know that Mama gets to open the mail this time of year. And as much as I love receiving cards, I love writing ours as well. Early on, I decided that when I sat down each year to write our family's Christmas letter, I would do my best to encapsulate our life as authentically as possible. I wanted these letters to craft our story as a reminder for years to come. Most of the time, I was able to articulate how we had seen God at work in our lives, but the year after Jensen was born, that was a struggle. Every time I thought about what I wanted to write, one word came to mind: hard. And nobody wants to read a Christmas letter about that. But staying true to my commitment, to remain authentic, I sat down to write the letter. I talked about our firstborn going to college and how hard that was for this mama's heart. I shared that even though it was exciting to be moving into a bigger home that would better fit our family and our needs, it's really hard to pack up 13 years of memories, all while being in and out of the hospital for 61 days that year. I shared about how hard it was to keep one of our kids in public school because she could get better services there. But we're a homeschooling family. There was just so much hard. And after writing all of it, it just felt unfinished. I wanted so badly to redeem it in some way. It wasn't the letter I wanted to send. So I took a shower. Anybody else hear the Lord in the shower? So while in the shower, I thought about the opposite of hard. I'm an English teacher, and by definition, we all know the opposite of hard is easy. But at this point, nothing in my life felt easy. So I was challenged to look at it through God's eyes. The opposite of hard is not easy. The opposite of hard is hope. It's always been hope. I was able to challenge the hard moments of that year in my mind and redeem them through the lens of hope. Even though things were not as I wanted them to be, I had hope that things would get better. At the very least, I had hope in the one who could make me feel better about them. It changed everything in how I saw our circumstances. I began to see that hopelessness was not a place I wanted to be. I could either focus on our crisis or I could cling to Christ. I simply could not be connected to both. I wish I could say that after that aha moment, I never felt hopeless again, but life kept shaking me, loosening my grip. My hope was still there, but often barely hanging on. And too often I tied it to the wrong things. If we can just get out of the hospital this time, then everything will be good. If we can just do that next surgery so she can breathe, or find that med to finally take her seizures away, she'll be fine. If we could just stay one step ahead of her needs, we won't need to go back to the hospital. Believing each one would finally make everything better. Instead, it became a constant fight to stay one step ahead. It took a toll on our family, but weirdly, it also created this indescribable bond. Throughout it all, we saw God show up over and over again. This allowed us to truly trust Him, and because of this, our resolve grew stronger. We were able to see that when we got good at navigating our hard, we knew it was God who was keeping us strong. As life has it, as soon as you think you have everything figured out, something happens. Grief has layers. We grieved the baby we lost in miscarriage. We grieved the loss of the normal lives Britland and Jensen were never going to have. We We grieved other areas of our lives that have not turned out exactly the way we'd expected. But losing a child, their sister, how does hope even exist in that kind of grief? 1 Thessalonians 4:13-14 says, "But we do not want you to be uninformed about those who are asleep, that you may not grieve as others do, who have no hope. For since we believe that Jesus died and rose again, even so through Jesus, God will bring with him those who have fallen asleep." The Bible says we will grieve, but it also tells us that we do not have to grieve without hope. Because Jesus defeated death, hope isn't just waiting for us on the other side of grief. It's what carries us through it. I love how Steve Carter, former pastor at Willow Creek Church, describes this type of hope. The hope we need in grief is gritty and courageous, the kind we find when all the other cliches are gone. Grief definitely requires a gritty and courageous hope. I didn't know how to find it. We had learned how to hold on to hope when life felt hard, but in grief we had lost control of everything. And yet, in God's goodness, he shares this in his word. Hebrews 6:11-12 says, "And we desire that each of you demonstrate the same diligence so as to realize the full assurance of hope until the end, so that you will not be sluggish, but imitators of those who through faith and endurance inherit his promises." The full assurance of hope. How does this idea of hope relate to grief? It's a confident hope. It's steady, unwavering. It's gritty and courageous. I've learned that hope sits with us in the heart, and it absolutely anchors us in the middle of grief. But what has become most apparent to me in my journey to discover true hope is that hope is different for those who believe in Jesus and those who don't. For those who don't yet know Jesus, hope is just a verb. For all of us, hope is something we do. We hope with anticipation and with longing. But if we don't know Jesus, hope is nothing more than a wish, a fragile feeling we cling to when we desperately want something to turn out a certain way. But for those of us who put our faith in Jesus, hope becomes something more than we do. Hope becomes a noun. Hope becomes something we have, not a wish, not a feeling, a person. Jesus is our living hope. True hope isn't crossing our fingers and hoping everything works out. Because what happens when it doesn't? True hope is stronger than that. It's steady. It's anchored. It looks honestly at the reality of life and still chooses to trust the promises and character of a God who can be trusted. So this morning, my focus has been on seeing hope in hard situations. Maybe you're having your own crisis of belief right now, wondering, wrestling, waiting for God to do something so that you know he's real. Maybe you're not in a season of hard right now, but you have been in the past. Praise God for this season you're in. Or maybe you think your heart is not hard enough to need the hope that only Jesus can give. John 16:33 says, "I have told you these things, so that in me you may have peace. In this world you will have trouble, but take heart, because Jesus, our living hope, has overcome the world." What would it take for you to change the way you see hope from a verb to a noun? To allow genuine hope to be your foundation so that when you face challenges, you can meet them with total confidence and full assurance. Well, I finally answered my daughter Brinkley's question that one she asked me in the car. I told her this: no, my life has not turned out the way I thought it would. Yet it's a funny thing about life this side of heaven. If things turned out the way I thought they should, I would be a very different person. My husband likes to say that God writes the stories that no one else would write. I would not have chosen hard. I would have preferred to stay on the mountaintop, yet I know that because of my wondering and my wrestling and my waiting, I will eventually find my way back up after I've grown my faith in the valley. Through my grief, I continue to witness hope. With each Jensen's book as I wrote, I saw hope that her story would not be forgotten or missed. And as cliche as it sounds, there were so many times I closed my laptop in awe of what the Lord had given me to write. All along, this life has been his story, but he has given me the honor of sharing it. So no, this is not the life I would have chosen, but it is the story God has written for me, and I would choose to live it all over again. Let me leave you with the verse I share when I sum up Jensen's life and legacy. It's from Romans 15:13. May the God of hope fill you with all joy and peace as you trust in him, so that you may overflow with hope by the power of the Holy Spirit. 3 of my family members are going to come out here right now. Tate, Tigan, and Brinkley wrote this song as a tribute to what God has done in their lives because of their sister, and it's an example of the hope we have that Jensen is living her best life in heaven.
I wish I could ask how you do. If Jesus' face made you flee, if you hold in your hands in the clouds, I wish I could hold your hands. You want to embrace your design. Did his arms feel the warm as a water? All the tears from your eyes, is he all that you wanted to find? I just wanna hear your voice again. What was the reason for the pain, all the heartbreak and the ache, the sorrow and the weight? And why did the potter choose to make a soul to be stuck in a cage, a body born to break? I know it hurts. Our Father formed you in secret, and he knew it was a choice that would be for your better when he put your pieces together. He wrote a story that never ends, he shattered a window that guides the light. You were not a mistake but a canvas. I know it all happened for a reason, so they could see between the gaps of your puzzle piece. Hope that you know how to change it. If the life that you live brought me Jesus, you showed me his peace through your pain, the silence you gave in your praise. I just want to hold your hand, just want you in my arms. Our Father formed you in secret, and he knew it was a choice that would be for you better when he put your pieces together. Oh, he wrote a story I never write. He shattered a window that guides the light. You were not a mistake but a canvas, and I know it. Oh, happened for a reason, so they could see between the gaps of your puzzle piece. I know it all happened for a reason, so our Father formed you to see. He knew it was a choice that would be for your better, and he put your pieces together. You wrote a story I'd never write. You shattered a window that guides the light. You were not a mistake but a canvas. I know it all happened for a reason, so they could see between the gaps of your puzzle pieces.
So if you have been living in your own kind of heart and searching for some genuine hope, not hope that exists with a wish or a prayer, but hope that is living, life-giving, the person of Jesus who came to overcome the hard. Maybe today is the day that you trade your fleeting wishes into a permanent witness and let God do what he longs to do in you. Someday, you will look back at the place you're in right now, where we were just a few years ago, and you'll be in disbelief that it was ever that hard, because it will have become so good. I've shared my heart and my heart with you this morning, and as I've been speaking, I know many of you have been thinking about your own lives. Some of you are carrying something that feels heavy, unresolved, or simply hard. Hope doesn't mean we rush past those things. Sometimes hope looks like letting someone else hold the weight for us for just a moment. As the worship team sings the next song, if anyone desires prayer, we're going to ask that you remain seated during that song. Everyone else will be invited to stand, but if you see someone who is seated next to you or near you, go over there, lay a hand on them, pray aloud or silently. It might be someone you came with, it might be a complete stranger. Then there will be 2 more songs, and for anybody desiring more private prayer after that, the ladies with the pink lanyards will be up front here. And we just want to invite you to come up and just share your heart with them and let them hold that for you and with you today.
Confused and very lost. I have profound grief, and I wasn't able to function well. For about a year, I wasn't able to leave the house or go to church. I found it very difficult to be able to take care of myself. I found myself asking I prayed to the Lord, prayed to God, and asked if I could die and go to heaven. And as I would do that, I wasn't getting an answer from him, and so I became more and more withdrawn and just continued to cry out at night. I would just ask, it's like, why? Why do I have to be here? I have no purpose in life. I have no direction. And I still felt like I wasn't getting an answer. I've gone through about a year of feeling lost, and I wasn't feeling well, and I went to the doctor and found out that I have terminal cancer. I have severe pain and nausea most of the time, and I asked God again if I could just die and go to heaven. It's like I thought that maybe that was the reason why I got the cancer, was that was the path I was on, that it was the plan, that my husband passed away, I didn't have to worry about him, and that I got the cancer, and then I could die and go to heaven. But I found out that that wasn't his plan. God had put people in my life that I was able to come out of the depression. I have a mentor that helps me, prays with me, and listens to me, and guides me. I was able to join a Bible study that has made all the difference in the world. I pray every day and read the Bible. And I actually pray continuously that I have a purpose, I have a mission in life, that I'm not finished yet, that God has His plan for me. And I feel it every day, that if I follow Him and listen to His words, then I have a direction, and He will take care of me. I have no doubt that at the end of my life, I will go to heaven. And when I do die, I will have eternal life. Because through this cancer diagnosis, I think God has shown me that I've actually got my life back. I'm able to live my life better than it was when I was well. There's a verse that I read every day, and it's, rejoice always, pray continually, give thanks in all circumstances, for this is God's will and for you in Christ Jesus. 1 Thessalonians 5:16-18. And the part of that I say every day is give thanks in all circumstances. And it's a reminder that whether you're well or whether you're ill, it's like God has His plan for you. I've had people ask me, how can you have joy? How can you be happy? How can you be excited about things in your life, knowing that you have a shortened lifetime? And I think that I say Jesus is joy, and I feel that with Jesus I have joy. Nobody knows their expiration date, but I feel like I've been given this opportunity to live well and follow Him, and just trust that there's a bigger plan.
More services when she was super young and still trying to figure stuff out. And sometimes her name was still in the system. I picked up the phone. Hello, I said. She's like, hi, Kristin, this is Jody from the bus garage. Is Berlin back in school? No. I said, why? Because she is currently on a bus headed to the middle school. I said, no, she isn't. She's probably actually in her room. She hasn't even gotten up yet. Well, Chris was listening to our conversation because I had it on speakerphone, and he's like, oh, actually, she's downstairs on the couch. So he runs down there to check. I go in her room, and I'm just all confused, and I say, Jody, I'm not really sure what's going on. And she said, well, I know what's going on. She's on a bus headed to the middle school. Meanwhile, Chris receives a call from his buddy who does the bus route in our area, and he's like, hey, I'm just wondering if Britlin's back in public school. Because sometimes, we don't get an updated roster, and she got on my bus this morning, and I asked her who her homeroom teacher was, and she had no idea, so I'm just calling to check. It was becoming very obvious that Britlin was, in fact, on a bus on her way to middle school. Not getting Parents of the Year at this point. And as I say, the plot thickens. Jakely wakes up, and our kids don't really have devices, but they have kind of this one iPad that they can sort of share. And Jakely sees a communication with Britlin and our neighbor girl. They've essentially, this thing on the iPad essentially laid out the plan for Britlin to get on the bus and be dropped off at the middle school so she could return to public school. They thought of everything. Well, everything except that Britlin's little friend is 2 years younger than she is, so she was going to the intermediate school, and Britlin had no idea where to go at the middle school. She did not care. She decided she'd just figure it out when she got there. Well, then my phone rang again. Hi, this is the secretary from the middle school. I said, yeah, I know. My husband's on his way to get her. So they come home. I remember sitting on the steps right inside our house, and she walks in the house. She had on an oversized sweatshirt, biker shorts, looked like she had no pants on. She had on flip-flops, and it was a cold October morning. She had an empty backpack, and there was zero chance she had combed her hair that day. She looked homeless. So I gave her a hug. I told her I was so glad she was safely home. And she dropped her empty backpack and she said, I hate homeschooling. I want to go back to public school. I said, well, that's not the way to get there. And then I reminded her that the Lord has called us to homeschool, and that is what we were going to continue doing. So we tell that story a lot. It's one of those where you're like, you just can't always make this stuff up, right? It's crazy. But there's more to the story, and often there are missing pieces we don't know about. She was in 7th grade when this happened, and that's not super typical behavior for a 7th grader. But remember, Britlin has a genetic disorder, and part of her disorder is developmental delay, and then she also was recently diagnosed with autism. So when you can put the pieces together a little bit, it does make a little bit more sense. About a year and a half ago, Diane Lee, who prayed earlier this morning, most of you know her, she had called to ask if I would consider speaking at this conference. And I was impressed that they were asking so far in advance. I had not lived in Aberdeen. I grew up here. This was my hometown, like I told you earlier, but I had not been back to this conference at all. And since I hadn't been here, I was like, well, maybe I should just come, look at it, see what I think, see if I'd be a good fit. So we came last year, and I remember walking into the arena a year ago, and I was shocked. Doubt immediately began to creep in. There were over 500 women that were here, eager to listen to the speaker and grow in their faith. And I remember texting my husband going, why in the world would they want to listen to me? And then I was like, I don't really have anything worthy to say to these women. I just began to question it. But I didn't want to let Diane down, and I wanted to stay open to what God had for me. So I prayed right then and there, and I asked him to show me whether he wanted me to be the speaker this year or not. We came into the theater where the sessions took place. I sat down and just observed. And I remember thinking, what are all of these women's stories? All ages, different stages of life, unique interactions and attitudes. And I said to the Lord, well, why would they want to listen to me? And that's when I felt him saying, what are their stories? Would things feel different to these women if they could share what God's been doing in their lives? Was God even part of their story yet? How many of these women were caught up in hiding their true story because they feared what other people would say? Suddenly I knew that the Lord wanted me to share what the theme is today. He wanted me to help women see that when When we learn to fall in love with our stories and confidently share them with others, we can see how we've been part of God's story all along. This morning I shared my story about my family and what we've been living the past few years, and I am so grateful for the opportunity to share Jensen's life and how it's impacted ours and others' lives. It's been a privilege to continue sharing her story, but it's not always been an easy story to share. Because I dedicated so much time writing her story, the good, the hard, the joys, the sorrows, I was able to find closure, connection, and compassion. Closure came for me as I pieced together all the pieces of her story that happened over the years. Connection has happened as our family has learned from others who are affected by her story, many of whom we've never met before. And compassion continues to grow as I can now empathize with other families who experience grief and loss. Well, you already know my husband's a youth pastor. Something he has found very effective in helping kids connect with each other and with Jesus is to have them tell their life story. Calling it a life story feels less scary than saying it's a testimony, but it's basically the same thing. A friend who's had kids go through our youth ministry recently asked me why we put so much importance on kids telling their stories. She wondered if maybe what they have to share is personal and not anyone else's business. I appreciated her concern, because a lot of times when you've been doing things for the same way for a long time, we don't always take a step back to question it. But this also caused me to wonder a few things. What keeps us from wanting to tell our stories? Some people have no problem sharing certain parts of their lives, but maybe only a few get to hear the entire story. Others agree with my friends and keep things close and unspoken. We all have our reasons, and most of us have our limits. Using the letters from the word story, let me suggest a few reasons we might be reluctant to share our stories. S, shame. Is there deep shame keeping us from being transparent? T, trauma. Has something happened that is too painful to talk about? O, offense. Have we hurt someone, or has someone deeply hurt us? R, reputation. Has something happened that makes us afraid for our reputation? If someone finds out what is happening, will people look at us differently or judge us? Or Y, yearning. Is there a longing in our lives for something we can't have, and it just continues to painfully echo? Maybe you're asking the same question my friend asked. Is it necessary for us to tell our story? Is it anyone else's business? Maybe it's not, but if I'm honest, I think it can make a difference. Telling your story has less to do with others and more to do with how you see God at work in your life. It is through sharing that we become vulnerable, which ultimately makes us authentic. Others are drawn to real. Our rawness puts us on a level playing field with others who are longing for the chance to be real too. In her book, People Pleaser, Ginger Duggar-Vuolo says this: "From the downfall of Bill Gothard to the horrible revelation about one of my siblings, here's one of the most important things I've learned. I won't live a lie. I've seen what happens when we pretend to be one thing, when we perform and posture while our reality is something else. And I've seen what happens when you and I are honest about our challenges, our struggles, our fears, and our mistakes. The light gets in. The grace shows up. Freedom is the experience of truth." Maybe this sounds familiar. Freedom is the experience of truth. John 8:32 says exactly this: "You will know the truth, and the truth will set you free." John is referring to Jesus here, and that by understanding the truth of who he is, we will be set free. Yet in God's wisdom, this is true for other areas of our lives as well. Once we begin to see things through the lens of truth and choose to stop hiding behind the hard, shirking away from the shame and ignoring our reality, we can begin to embrace the life God has given us. Last spring, a friend felt led to give me a book. She said as she read it, my name kept coming to mind. The book is called Shatterproof by Lauren Sisler. It's about a sports commentator who lost both of her parents on the same night, just a couple hours apart. Both died from a drug overdose. She had no knowledge that either of them suffered from addiction until after they died. And for years, she never told the true story. She was embarrassed that her parents were addicts, so she told a story that felt safer to tell. Eventually, as it nagged at her spirit more and more, she learned to accept the truth. Although she never understood why things happened the way they did, she began to see how this part of her life influenced other parts of her journey. And as she allowed perspective to take root, she learned to fall in love with her story. So how is that possible? When life has been difficult and things aren't going the way we've hoped, how can falling in love with our story even be attainable? Sometimes it can't happen in the moment. Often being ready to share our story takes time. While Jensen was in the hospital, we could update her caring bridge. People would reach out to help with our kids and offer us meals. But I specifically remember when a close friend of mine was going through a very different medical battle with her daughter. She suffered in silence. Her daughter was going through a mental health struggle and had been suicidal. My friend would call me from the emergency room, crying out for her daughter to find relief. Yet because it was such a personal and private sickness that carried a different stigma, she didn't feel she could let everyone know. Both of us had sick daughters. One of us could share our story as it happened, and the other had to wait until she was on the other side. Her daughter has found healing and is doing much better, and now they do share about the struggles they endured. But getting to that point took time. Well, many things keep us from telling our stories, but ultimately, until we understand God's story, we will never fully learn to fall in love with ours. So how does understanding God's story have anything to do with ours? Well, I've already mentioned that I'm a pastor's wife. I also have a Bible major from the University of Northwestern, and neither of these things means that I have the Bible figured out. In fact, anytime I've ever attempted to read the Bible in a year, I have failed miserably. I'm a super competitive person, and when I fell behind a day or two, I usually felt defeated and just gave up. And then I found the Bible Recap. This is a commentary that provides a year-long chronological reading plan. Once I realized how much I was loving and learning from this resource, I decided that no matter what, I was going to read through the Bible, even if it took me 2 years. And it did. I just finished reading through the Bible for the first time last week. And I actually, it was just the best feeling. I texted people, I'm very proud of myself. But never have I loved the Old Testament as much as I have this past 2 years. I even teared up a little bit as I read the last verses of Malachi and my time in the Old Testament was finished. I learned a lot while reading the Old Testament. I actually read about the minor prophets and fell in love with the women in their essential roles. I better understood the covenants, and I was shocked to see that much of the sin in the Bible rivals the sin in our world today. I saw a God who is faithful, a God who is just, a God who loved fiercely, and a God who remained constant through it all. I learned that God is who he says he is, and that my faith is real. I read about Joseph, his life went from a prison to a palace. His brothers sold him into slavery, and later he was unjustly thrown into prison. God used those painful years to put Joseph in a position as Pharaoh's right-hand man. This allowed him to save his family and his nation from famine. Genesis 50:20 says, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good." I learned that God turns betrayal, injustice, and delay into a greater purpose. Then there was Moses and the Israelites in Egypt. God's people suffered as slaves under Pharaoh's harsh rule for hundreds of years. God used that suffering to show his power and his faithfulness. He miraculously delivered them. Exodus 14:14 says, "The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still." I saw that God's goodness is often revealed through deliverance that only he can accomplish. Ruth, I loved learning about Ruth. Committed to her mother-in-law Naomi, Ruth went from loss to legacy. When Naomi lost her husband and sons, Ruth was left a foreign widow with no security. So God provided a redeemer in Boaz, who restored her family and set things up for Ruth to be part of the lineage of David and ultimately Jesus. Ruth 2:20 says, "The Lord has not stopped showing his kindness to the living and the dead." I learned that God's goodness shows up through faithful love, redemption, and restoration after a significant loss. A story I loved as a kid took on new meaning as well. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were thrown into the blazing furnace for refusing to worship an idol. God was literally with them in the fire. Because of their faith in God, they were unharmed, and others acknowledged God's power. God's goodness doesn't always keep us out of the fire, but it brings us safely through it. A new book that came to life for me was Ezekiel. Through his life, I saw that God is just in his punishment for sin. God is faithful because he keeps his promises. And God restores as he brings new life, forgiveness, and hope. Ezekiel 36:26-27 says, "I will give you a new heart. I will put a new spirit in you. I will remove your heart of stone and give you a heart of flesh." Toward the end of the Old Testament in my study, this synopsis from the Bible recap sums things up beautifully. Israel has despised God and broken the covenant. And do you know what his response is? He leans in. He broadens and deepens his covenant with his people by expanding the covenant. They broke the conditional covenant, so he makes an eternal one. They've broken it, and he'll atone for their sins. He will cover the cost himself. Do you see him tipping them off to the plan for Jesus' arrival on the scene? That has been his plan all along, to restore his people to himself. God's excessive love is shocking, stupefying, and praise-inducing. He's where the joy is. And when I began to understand that God is this amazing, that he longs to restore people to himself, and that he loves me in this manner, that is when I began to accept how my story fits right in with his story. Paul Miller says in his book, A Praying Life, "If God is sovereign, he is in control of all the details of my life. If he is loving, then he is going to be shaping the details in my life for good. If he is all wise, then he's not going to do everything that I want because I don't even know what I need. If he's patient, he will take the time to do this." And when we put all these things together, God's sovereignty, his love, wisdom, and patience, we have a divine story. And when we change how we view our circumstances in light of who he is and what he's done, the next natural step is to fall in love with our own story. But only God can actually flip the script as we allow him to revise our perspective. Let's take a new look at those letters we previously defined in story. S. God will take your shame as we surrender it to him. God will trade your trauma for a testimony as you accept his gracious healing. Oh, God will overcome your offenses with openness as you begin to see truth. R. God will redeem your reputation when you let him define who you are. And Y. God will change your yearning into a fulfilling story that is yours. So why should we tell our stories? I mentioned this morning that my husband likes to say that God writes the stories we would never choose to write. And it's worth repeating. Yes, ultimately he is the author, but he has chosen to make us an essential part in his big picture plan. We should tell our stories because doing so not only helps us gain perspective to better understand and accept what has been written for us, it also allows us to be a true testimony of what God is doing. This doesn't mean you have to stand up in front of 500 women or 50 women, and you don't have to write a book. It's just as powerful when you share with even one person. Maybe the first step for you is to write your story, then invite someone to coffee, share your story. Hopefully they will feel comfortable sharing theirs as well. And this is how you can truly begin to live life together. About a year and a half ago, my husband and I, along with 2 other couples from our church, decided to start a small group. Not knowing which direction to take with the Bible study, we decided to begin our time together sharing our life stories, one couple at a time. The 3 of us couples who started the group shared our stories first. At the end of each story, we affirmed each other and we prayed for each other. There were a couple of couples that did not want to share their story at first, but eventually everyone did. And not only did this allow us to really get to know each other, but it also provided a safe place to share, and it bonded us in an incredible way. 3 of these couples no longer attend our church, but we never miss a month of meeting together as a group. Telling our stories has connected us and has allowed us to live out the gospel together. We need to share our stories. As I said before, telling your story has less to do with others, what they might think or believe or assume, and more to do with how you see God at work in your life. When my kids were younger, I bought the lie that a pastor's family had to have solid kids, at least in public. It might have been possible to have perfect soldiers for Jesus if I had only had a few kids, but probably not, because it doesn't matter how many kids you have. Parenting is hard work. I soon saw that my kids would never be perfect, and I would probably go crazy trying to present them as such. When I was a younger parent, a wise older friend told me, "Your kids will greatly bless you." And then she said, "But they're going to disappoint you too." I appreciated this wisdom, and as life happened and more kids entered the mix, it became clear that I couldn't control everything they did or what happened to them. Still, it wasn't until someone shared the following quote with me that I was able to define what God had been revealing to me about the stories each of my children would live. The quote was this: "You can't protect your children from their testimony." You can't protect your children from their testimony. Well, during COVID, we were home together every day. Max and Sydney even came to live with us during this time. Sydney helped us care for Jensen, and Max's college, where they were living in married housing, had shut down. Macy, who was the missionary in Mexico at the time, had also been sent home until the borders reopened. We spent a lot of time together during those weeks and months. Chris decided to spend mealtime asking the kids questions. One day, he posed the question, "What has been the hardest thing that's ever happened to you?" Collectively, every person said, "Jensen." A few days later, he asked, "What has been the best thing that has ever happened to you?" Unanimously, the response was the same, "Jensen." Our kids went through hard stuff on Jensen, spent so many days in the hospital, when the ambulance was at our house once again, and when they almost lost their sister twice before they were there to witness her passing away. We had to trust that they would turn to him when things got difficult. We've loved seeing the bond that they share with each other, yet through all of those difficult moments, we couldn't protect them from their testimony. Prior to COVID, my daughter Macy lived in Mexico. After she graduated from high school, she moved to Ensenada to do a discipleship training school with YWAM and stayed to join their staff. After living there for over a year, she had just moved into a new apartment with some other missionary friends. They were responsible for finding someone to hook up their washer and dryer, which happened to be right outside Macy's bedroom. Macy's friend Ashley was visiting and had asked to take a nap in Macy's room. An explosion occurred due to a gas leak from the newly installed appliances. Macy literally had to pry open the wall to get to Ashley, who'd been badly burned. And then we got a call that no parent ever wants to receive. A very hysterical daughter who was okay, but not okay at the same time. Minnesota to Mexico was very far away. Just a few weeks later, after the fire, Macy got called home in the middle of the night because Jensen wasn't expected to make it until the next day. Jensen did survive, and while Macy recovered from her traumatic experiences, she took a trip to Tennessee to see some friends she met while serving in Mexico. While there, she met her husband. Eventually, she was able to see the Lord's hand in everything, but while it was happening, we couldn't protect her from her testimony. The past couple of years have been difficult for Brinkley. High school can be lonely without a solid friend group. Walking this road with my daughter and watching her grow through her struggles has been so hard. But because of this, she and I have developed a sweet bond. I yearn for her to have sweet friendships, but while she's still figuring this out, I can't protect her from her testimony. A little over a year ago, my son Tygan had just moved 5 hours away to Green Bay, Wisconsin, to live closer to his girlfriend of 3 years. After dating long distance for a year after high school, he felt it was time to make the move. He found a job and settled into work and wait until she finished college, where she was playing D1 basketball. However, after just 1 month there, she broke up with him. It was very unexpected to all of us, and we weren't there to help him process his pain. In God's goodness, though, he gave him a roommate that became like a brother to him, a church who helped him grow in his faith. And throughout that year in Green Bay, God wooed him to Ensenada, Mexico, where he is now serving wholeheartedly as a missionary. But while he was enduring that confusing pain and the loneliness of that broken relationship, he couldn't protect him from his testimony. My son Tate served with Tygan in Mexico this past year. After being there for a few weeks, he actually broke his finger playing basketball. Not knowing he should come home after his outreach trip to China or not, he'd been told by a Mexican doctor that he would probably need surgery. He finally came home to meet with a local surgeon, only to be told that his finger had healed and surgery was no longer needed. Tate decided to remain in Minnesota, to raise money with the hope of returning to Mexico this May. While at home, he was presented with the opportunity to become a worship leader at a nearby church. Being a worship leader is his dream job, but taking it would mean that he won't be able to return to Mexico as he originally planned. Choosing to surrender his wants, he was offered a position and won't be returning to Mexico at this time. Submitting to God's will is not always easy, and his sadness for giving up something dear to him is real. But even when the outcome isn't bad, just different, we can't protect him from his testimony. Recently, I heard a friend share her story, and she talked about how often we are willing to share most of our story, but rarely do we feel safe sharing it all. She likened it to holding cards in a poker game. Are we continuing? Will we play all our cards, or are we continuing to hold on to our ace? Is there a part of our story that we just can't bring ourselves to tell? I realize that my ace has actually been my son Max's story. Max and I have always been close. He's my firstborn. We've done life together for the longest, and I never doubted his love for Jesus or our family. And when he went to college, I had no concerns about how things would be for him. He was going to the same Christian college that Chris and I had gone to, and we were excited for him to grow in his faith like we had. We didn't know until several years after college that Max had had a crisis of belief while he was there. During that uncertain time, and completely unknown to us, one of his roommates who had transferred in Max's second year became known as the campus drug dealer. Never did we consider that this would happen at our college, and never did we think that Max would be curious enough to try something. But he did, and we had no idea it was happening. As he went through this time of questioning his faith and learning to make it his own, the Lord met him there. Today, he is completely sold out for Jesus and certain of his faith in Christ. But while he was going through that season of rebellion, we couldn't protect him from his testimony. We can't protect our children from their testimonies, but we can encourage them to share their stories, and we do. I think that is why my husband sees the significance of young people telling their stories. Sharing their life with others becomes natural and authentic. They don't feel the need to hide things. They learn that their story matters and that people can relate to it. It builds connection with others and fosters accountability and encouragement to keep fighting the good fight. They experience freedom from the truth. And as parents, we learn to give grace as we accept their stories as extensions of our own. We deserve them connecting with God and with others in their own humility. But just as we can't protect our children from their testimonies, we can't hide from our own testimonies either. So if we can't dictate our testimonies and have no real ability to write them the way we think they should be written, we have no choice but to trust that God has a plan that is bigger, better, and more glorious than what we can comprehend. And the only way for others to catch a glimpse of that plan is for us to tell our stories. All over Scripture, it tells us to be vocal about what the Lord has done. 1 Peter 2:9. But you are a chosen people, that you may declare the praise of him who called you out of darkness and into his wonderful light. Psalm 107:2. Let the redeemed of the Lord tell their story about those he redeemed from the hand of the foe. When Paul is talking to the Corinthians, he tells them in 2 Corinthians 3:2-4, you yourselves are a letter written on our hearts, known and read by everybody. You show that you are a letter from Christ, the result of our ministry, written not with ink, but by the Spirit of the living God, not on tablets of stone, but on tablets of human hearts. Such confidence as this is ours through Christ before God. Not that we are competent in ourselves, but our competence comes from God. And finally, Revelations 12:11, just read this last week, says, they triumphed over him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony. The blood of the Lamb is what Jesus did, refers to what Jesus did on the cross. The word testimony refers to believers openly confessing their faith. But it is not just words. It's living out that faith in action. It's telling our story to strengthen other believers, to encourage them to trust God no matter what they face in life. We discover perspective, we achieve freedom, and we ultimately find victory by sharing the word of our testimony. Our past, present, and future are all handled by Jesus. There's no frame in the story of our lives where he isn't active. He's at work in all of it to bring us into fullness of relationship with himself. Sometimes the most beautiful testimonies begin as the chapters we prayed would disappear. But God doesn't waste those chapters. He turns them into reminders that even in the hardest seasons, they can be part of a story that will point others back to him. So when you get to the other side of whatever it is you're going through, no matter what it looks like, there will be people who need to hear how we made it. And get this, silence makes the woman behind us feel like she's all alone. We are currently living our future testimony of God's faithfulness. Take good notes. Because until we are with Jesus, our story is still being written. But as we share our stories and the light of how they fit into God's story, we will be able to honestly and wholeheartedly fall in love with our stories. Your story matters. God's story matters. The best story combines the two. Well, today we've talked about hope in the hard, and we've talked about falling in love with your story. Those aren't two separate ideas. Hope is what anchors us when the story hurts. Our story makes hope personal. Before we leave today, I want to invite you to do one quiet thing. It doesn't have to be something public. It doesn't have to be something emotional. It just has to be something honest. Some of you are leaving today feeling encouraged, I hope. Some of you are leaving today still feeling tired. And some of you are leaving with the same heart you walked in with. And none of this means that today missed its mark. Because hope doesn't mean that everything changes in a day. Sometimes hope is just realizing that you're not alone in your story. And that God hasn't stepped away from it, especially the hard parts. So I want you to think of one part of your story that you've been resisting, avoiding, or wishing were different. And instead of pushing it away, place it back into God's hands. One day, you will look back and realize that the chapters you wanted to skip were some of the key chapters, the best chapters God was writing just for you. And someday, you might just recognize that hope is not the absence of hard. Hope is knowing that your story is actually being held, every page of it, by a faithful God. So as you leave today, know this. telling your story is important. You don't have to know the ending to trust the author. And you don't have to love every chapter to believe God is still writing something good. Thank you for showing up today and for allowing my family a tiny space in your story. It has been such a gift for us to be with you.